Good afternoon and welcome everyone to Tuesday Times Roundtable. This week's session titled Different Ways of Seeing the World, What It Means to Be Bilingual. My name is Michelle Zaldivar. I am your program coordinator here at the Office of Global Learning Initiatives. A special thank you to Ms. Sherry Beeson, who is our senior program coordinator, manning the chat and answering your questions as they come. Please feel free to throw those questions in the chat. We are there to answer them for you. If you haven't already, please take a moment to sign in. You can use this QR code or the short link that is in the chat right now. Sign in from all community participants is encouraged, please and thank you. It's what helps us continue to bring you some programming. If you're ready to read this week's article, because all TTRs are based on a New York Times article, you can find that at the Go link, go.fiu.edu/TTR Feb 15. If you're getting to that point and you're realizing that you have not quite gotten access yet, I've got great news for you. Tuesday Times Roundtable is presented to you in partnership between the Office of Global Learning Initiatives here at FIU and the New York Times. With that partnership comes free access to everyone in our FIU community. So if you haven't already set up your access, you can do so at accessnyt.com. And again, you can read this week's article at go.fiu.edu/TTR Feb 15. If for whatever reason, especially if you're off campus, you're having some issues getting connected at accessnyt.com, you can find some more information at go.fiu.edu/NYT. Some quick announcements before we officially get started, especially to my Global Learning Medallion students. Remember that TTR is always 1 point. Make sure to take a moment and screenshot your sign-in so that you can claim that in your points log for this semester. If you want to learn more about our Global Learning Medallion or any of the programs here at the Office of Global Learning Initiatives, please feel free to reach out, either hang out at the end of the session today, and I will be here to answer your questions, so as will Sherry. Or email us at glmedal@fiu.edu. FIU Global is holding a really special, I don't want to call it contest, but kind of. They are accepting student proposals, innovative student proposals for the World Center Italy Awareness Campaign. If your proposal is accepted, you can travel to Genoa, Italy, and build on that programming, be an ambassador for FIU as they bring awareness to our World Center over in Italy. More information at go.fiu.edu/Italy. The deadline is February 27th. We have a very special guest introducer today. Our executive director here at the Office of Global Learning Initiatives, Dr. Hilary Landorf, is here to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Landorf, I hand it off to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Good afternoon, good evening, bonjour et bonsoir. It's my pleasure to introduce Victoria Sisouphone. Victoria grew up in Ithaca, New York. Questions of bilingualism came at a young age, especially as her father spoke French, while other members of her family spoke Lao. After years of education in English, she said that she lost her Lao. So after her first year at Ithaca College, she set off on an adventure to find her family's language. At 19 years old, she went to Paris, where she was accepted into and later obtained her bachelor's degree in second language learning or applied linguistics and the Lao language at the Institut National des Langues et Civilisations Orientales, or INALCO. Victoria is currently a graduate student in applied linguistics at INALCO. The topic of her master's thesis is the role of mistakes in language learning within a bilingual, multilingual environment. And on a personal note, I met Victoria this past fall while on a Fulbright International Education Administrators Program. As part of the program, my Fulbright colleagues and I, some of whom are here today, yay, attended a panel discussion with professors and students at INALCO. All of us agreed that this discussion was one of the most illuminating of our entire 2 weeks in France. And for me, the standout of the discussion was Victoria. She had such a compelling story and represented all three desired outcomes of global learning: making connections between important issues that affect us all on local and global levels, seeking out and respecting multiple perspectives on these issues, and actively engaging in addressing them in a way that only she can do. So I invited Victoria on the spot to lead a Tuesday Times Roundtable discussion, and voila, here she is today. Victoria, we're so glad to have you.
Good evening, everybody. Bonsoir tout le monde. It's really nice to have everybody here. I'd really like to quickly thank Florida International University for inviting me, Dr. Landorf for having me here as well, for inviting me as well, Michelle for helping me organize this presentation. It was a bit of a big organization. And then on the French side, I'd also like to thank Madame Céline Peignet, my director, who kindly enough took the time to look at my presentation. And then Monsieur Gilles Forlot, who also had the time to look at my presentation and give me some feedback. So I'm just gonna share my screen and get started a little bit. Here we go. I apologize if I'm not technologically, all right, let's see. There we are. All right, I think everybody can see. All right. Start the up. Okay. So the title of the presentation today is going to be What It Means to Be Bilingual, Different Ways of Seeing the World. And I wanted to start off a little bit with a little bit of a fact. You know, in the book of Homer that was written in ancient Greek, the color blue is not mentioned once, which is strange because in modern Greek, we see, or in modern Greece, we see a lot of blue everywhere. But the color blue is not mentioned once. It's because the color blue never existed in ancient Greek, and they never actually acknowledged that color in general. My point is that languages form the way we think, the way we see the world. And imagine what it's like for people who speak multiple languages, who are bilingual or multilingual. And today I'd like to kind of explore those kinds of dimensions, those very dynamic, very complex dimensions of speaking multiple languages. So before we get started, I'd like to give a little context of my institution. I think it's kind of quite interesting for some. So INALCO, or Institut National des Langues et Civilisations Orientales, was created in 1795. It's the only public institution in the world that offers over 100 languages. And it's a lot of languages with various degrees, various disciplines within. We have about 9,000 students, 3,000 courses, over 120 nationalities, faculty, basically, and students included, over 100 international scientific events when there's not coronavirus, of course. It's a very big institution with a lot of languages. Here are some of our departments. We have about 15 of them. And we have about we say 6 subsections of professionalizing sections where we can specialize in international studies, international trade, foreign language teaching, in this case, sort of applied linguistics, my section. And it's a little kind of bit like Hogwarts. Everybody goes into their house, is everybody sorted into their area of studies. And it's actually quite interesting. It's quite fun when you get there. Just to give you a sense of the list of languages that we have, it's quite incredible. This is only on the African continent. I haven't gone through everything yet, yeah? So on the African continent, for example, we can see we have varieties of Arabic. That's really interesting. I have other sorts of languages such as Wolof, which is a little rare. In the Americas, we offer Mayan languages. In this case, Inuit is also a language that is offered. And every single sort of section offers cultural studies courses, anthropology, ethnology, geography, you name it. We learn almost everything. We have a lot of people coming from all over the world. And then we have a little bit of Europe and Eurasia as well. Pretty long list. It was kind of hard to put that in the PowerPoint. It's pretty impressive. And in this case, you can see a little bit of the languages we offer in that sort of area of the world. There's, for example, Yiddish, Georgian, and Slovak. And then finally, we also have the Middle East and Maghrebian department with, again, Arabic in all its multiple forms, and other languages such as Kurdish, Persian, Turkish, Yiddish, etc. So you can see we have a big selection of languages. And then lastly, we're actually in my department, the Southeast Asian Department in Pacific, where of course you have Lao, which is on the list. There's also Khmer from Cambodia. You can also have Mon, which is another way of saying Hmong, which is a language that comes from the northern mountains of Laos. So it's a pretty large selection. And I was sorted into my house as Hermione. I'd like to think that our house is Gryffindor, but, and this is basically our selection of languages in the Southeast Asian department. So on the schedule for today, I just like to go through it real quick. The first down the list is basically, I'm going to be going through a little bit of my linguistic history, how I got to INALCO. And then secondly, we'll talk a little bit about the real definition of bilinguals and types of definition, if there is a real definition. Thirdly, there will be advantages and disadvantages of bilinguals, the heart of the conversation with the New York Times article. Superior skills, do bilinguals have superior social skills? And then fourthly, different ways of seeing the world. I've asked some of my classmates to give some of their perspectives on what it's like to speak multiple languages. And I think it's a really good way for you to get a sense of how we feel about languages. And then lastly, I'd like to give a little place to the conclusion, talk a little bit about linguistic identity and multilingual education, and of course, time to take questions. Okay. All right. Next. So we're going to start off. First off, I'd like to share a map of the linguistic diversity that can be found in the USA. This was posted by UPenn in 2019 from the Institute for Research in Cognitive Science, their language log. I would just like to note that this does not include Spanish speakers. There are 37 million, approximately 37 million Spanish speakers in the United States. And so it is considered to be the second most spoken language in the United States. These are the languages that are present in households after that language, after Spanish. And as we can see, they've kind of constrained it into the states. So for example, in New York, we have Chinese. In California, we have Tagalog, which is from the Philippines, Vietnamese in Texas, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a little outlook of what that is. What I'd like to be very precise or be specific about is that in English, usually when we talk about multilingual in general, to describe the collective, we talk about the multilingual collective, and we talk about the multilingual individual, the person who possesses multiple languages. In French, we actually divide those two terms. For the individual, we use plurilingual for the individual and their multiple languages, and we use multilingual for the societies that have multiple languages functioning within their social fabric. I hope I haven't lost anybody yet. All right, moving on to the next slide. I'd like to share a little bit about my own linguistic journey that is actually, how would you say it, quite complex. I was raised in a Lao diaspora in Ithaca, New York. My family came after the war. They were refugees from the Vietnam War. And Lao was spoken at home for a very long time. And when I went to elementary school, I finally was put in an ESL class and was told that English is the priority, and that I understood at a very young age that if I didn't learn English well enough, that my grades wouldn't be as good. And in this case, what I had done was essentially accepted English as a role in my language, and I had put Lao on the back burner at the price of course, maybe losing Lao in that case. And at 10 years old, I completely stopped speaking. And I started concentrating myself in English, and I started pushing myself in English, reading in English. And little by little, I started to kind of distance myself from my family and their language. Just in like all Americans, in middle school and high school, we learned a second language. I had actually picked Spanish in this case. And I took it for about 5 years. And unfortunately, with regrets, I never really got used to it. And I wasn't able to really assimilate that language into my mind. And so I kind of let it go. I let go Spanish as a language. And then when I got to college and I decided to do a major in English, ironically enough, a major in English, I wanted to take Arabic. I took a semester of Arabic. And I think one of my old classmates who's present here, she can say that I had a really hard time with Arabic. And the only word I remember is Habibi. So unfortunately, Arabic didn't stick either. It was a very hard alphabet to learn and I didn't really get through it. And then finally, French came along in college. But French came along because I had the goal of coming to Paris when I was 19. I said, why not? I'm young. Life is crazy. Let's go to Paris. I had an opportunity. I learned 1 semester of French at my university at college with a really great professor. And then I got to Paris, suitcase, $200 in my pocket. And I said, let's go, let's do this. I had never been so terrified in my life. And learning French was a really great experience. It was a very great experience, but a very hard experience. And then I found INALCO. And INALCO was actually an institution that was introduced to me by one of my friends who was actually studying at Descartes at that time, Paris Descartes. And he said, hey, listen, there's this institute who teaches multiple languages. Maybe they have Lao. I'm like, no, they don't have Lao. It's a rare language. They can't have that. I went there, they had Lao. I was like, that's impossible. Who teaches Lao? No one teaches Lao in the United States. But then I realized something. When I got into INALCO and I decided to study Lao, my French was not only not good, but Lao looked like that. And I said to myself, that's Lao? That's my family's language? I've never seen that before. And my family's never told me that this is their language. And it's actually quite complex, just to kind of give you a notion of how complex this language is. There are 27 consonants. They're divided into 3 different sections: a higher consonant, middle consonant, lower consonants. It's kind of like math, which I'm terrible at. And then down below to the left corner, we have 33 vowels. Yeah. And then we have 4 accent tones. So I continued for 3 more years in my bachelor's, specializing in Lao and understanding where my family comes from and what their language was. And I wanted to refine my language. I wanted to refine my family's language, and I wanted to know what their language was because I had lost it. And it was a choice and it wasn't a choice. And I set off and I worked hard years to do it. I translated between French and English and Lao for a really long time. And I finally got there and I got my bachelor's and specialized in Lao and applied linguistics. I just wanted to kind of take a little time to just acknowledge my family. To the left, we can see that's me in the center at a beauty pageant for the Lao New Year. With my grandmother to the right and my mother on the left. And later on, I understood why the Lao New Year actually happened in April and not, I don't know, in January, because of historical reasons. Thank you, INALCO, for giving me those cultural lessons and courses. And then to the right, we have a picture of my grandfather, who's the only person in the family who can actually read Lao besides me. And I actually had brought a book from INALCO from our library for him to read. And this was the first book that he had actually read since before the war. It had been 50 years since he had never seen a book in Lao. And for him to see that book, it mattered to him. It valorized his language. He said his language is important too. And I wanted to show my parents and my family that Lao is important too, not just English. And that was really important for me to do. And in my bachelor's, I was able to do that. And despite that journey, and despite the hardship, and despite my final exam, which is on this next slide, I was able to get that degree. I wanted to put this slide in as an illustration of the kind of linguistic gymnastics we have to go through at INALCO. It's not as if we concentrate on one language. We concentrate on the relationship between languages. And just explaining this slide real quick, this is my professor who's a polyglot in Southeast Asian languages. And instead of erasing what he's written, he's decided to change marker color. Wonderful. In about 4 or 5 different languages that are related to one another in script to understand the historical preference, the historical context of each language so that we could relate to our languages in the own family group. And the exam was basically to translate all of these languages into French and then into Lao. So just to give an idea of what we train to do at INALCO, is we don't train just to learn languages, but we train to actually live with those languages and to actually be dynamic and be able to be flexible with those languages. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the types of bilinguals and what is the real definition of bilinguals. And before I quickly go there, I think there's a little bit of a Zoom poll that I kind of put up. I encourage you all to participate if you can. The question is, what's your experience with languages? This is interesting. And we'll talk about it at the end. I'm going to keep going with the presentation, but we'll talk about it at the end, yeah? So moving on. Hold on, there we go. So the types of bilinguals, excuse me, I think my screen is messing up. The types of bilinguals. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about how languages are acquired in bilinguals. And I think it's really kind of interesting. And then we'll move on and more into social linguistics. This is what we call more neurolinguistic level of languages. I'd like us to imagine a family of 4, 2 parents, a child about 5 years old, and a teenage boy around 13 or 14 years old, moving from France, let's just say France, why not? France, and coming into the United States, right? In this case, the phenomenon of compound bilingualism would describe how the 5-year-old actually acquires her language before the age of 7, meaning that she learns both linguistic codes at the same time, meaning the concepts are constructed in her brain at that same moment. If she learns, for example, the word airplane in English, the word avion in French is going to coincide with that, and there will be no sort of gap between that sort of linguistic, how would you say, acquisition of codes. Then we have the coordinate bilingual, which is going to be the teenager, the 13-year-old, 14-year-old, probably not really happy to be there because he left all his friends behind. And he gets into school. He has French at home with his family and maybe with his sister, maybe not, maybe with his sister he speaks English, I don't know. And outside of the household, he has English at school, English with his friends, etc. In this case, he acquires the 2 sets of concepts before the critical period hypothesis, where we esteem that afterwards it's harder to kind of have native competency. And in this case, he acquires the 2 sets of languages at the same time still. And then lastly, we have what we call the subordinate bilingual or bilingualism. This is also what we call late bilingualism. And this would be applied to the parents. And the parents actually use to learn the secondary language, they need to filter it through the first language. In this instance, those parents would have to filter all of what they're learning in their what they're learning in English, they have to filter it through French. You can still get there, but it's a little harder to filter through. And late bilingualism is possible, of course. There are multiple types of bilingualism and multiple types of bilinguals that exist, but I wanted to kind of go through one of them, and I thought that would be really neat to explore and to talk about, because I believe it's really applicable to a lot of what's happening in the United States in general in households. So the first sort of phenomenon that I'd like to talk about is actually called code switching. And this is what we call a part of alternating bilingualism. Code switching is when we start a sentence in one language and we finish it in another, or we mix the 2 codes at the same time. And this is usually when bilinguals find themselves between one another. They share the same languages, and then they just start shooting in both languages at the same time. And it's a really sort of enriching thing to witness and also to be a part of. In this instance, I gave the example, va chercher Marc and bribe him with avec un chocolat chaud with cream on top. Go get Mark and bribe him with a hot chocolate with cream on top. In this case, you mix the 2, French and English. And then we have the phenomenon which is called code mixing. And code mixing is very interesting because it's not the same. It's not the same thing. This is an example that was actually taken from my professor, Monsieur Forlot, from the Acadian region in the Maritime Province in New Brunswick, in northeast, just above Maine of the United States. And the sentence says, "J'ai switché le télé on." I switch on the TV. I switched on the TV in English. And then the second example would be, "Il faut le déliter." To delete, it needs to be deleted. And in this instance, what we can see is that switch on as a phrase or as vocabulary, as a word, is actually simulated into French, but it's simulated into French in the sense of with the French grammar. So we have, for example, the English lexicon, when we borrow that word and then we apply French grammar onto it and we turned it into a French category, actually, in this case. So it's actually a very interesting sort of phenomenon. I hope I haven't lost anybody yet. All right, moving on. Before I get to the advantages and disadvantages, I'd like to talk a little bit about the poll that we have here. Let's see. What's your experience with languages? Monolingual, 22%. All right, let's see. So 12 people believe that they're monolingual, all right? And then we have 28 people who believe they're bilingual, and then 14 people who believe that they're multilingual. Okay, for the people who believe that they're monolingual, I'd like to ask the question, what does that actually mean? Because you could, for example, understand a language. You can understand a language and not speak it, and then you would still be considered bilingual. So I think we need to understand and deconstruct the misconception that being bilingual or speaking a language means basically you have to be competent and very, very competent in those languages. Everybody's been exposed to a language, and I don't believe anybody can be really monolingual. So for those who actually talked about being monolingual, I don't think it's really possible. I'd like for those people to reflect on that and really also think about the languages that you've been exposed to in the world, in life, with people, even if it's just a word. It is really important to reflect on that we no longer live in a monolingual world. And monolinguals it's very rare to be, because you're always exposed to languages. So just to kind of take a note on that, multilingual, that's very interesting. I'd like to hear more about that in our discussion. I'll hear how many languages we have here. Maybe we'll have that at the end of the discussion. All right, great. Thank you for participating in the poll. That's really great. I'd like to move on to the next point, the advantages and disadvantages of bilinguals. Do we have superior social skills? All right, let's see. I don't know why my mouse is, there we go. All right. So I hope everybody's not scared. Don't get scared of the diagram. I swear I'll explain it. Essentially, in bilingualism, there is this really pertinent researcher. His name is François Grosjean, and he actually wrote in English. So I'd recommend people who are interested in the questions of bilingualism to go and read him. He's actually quite interesting. And he talks a little bit about being bilingual. He has a blog, a personal blog, and he's written a lot in English, more than in French, by the way. And he actually proposed this sort of diagram to talk about the complexities of how languages work within multilingual or bilingual individuals. I'd like to say that the misconception that we have the perfect bilingual is not possible. It's not possible to have a bilingual that masters the languages in all domains and all sort of walks of life. There are some bilinguals that are more comfortable speaking one language academically and socializing in another. And it's not possible to have the perfect bilingual. It's a man-made story. It's a myth. Even translators and interpreters are not perfect, you know, and that needs to be considered when thinking about what it means to be bilingual and multilingual. Here I'm talking about the everyday bilingual. And in this case, we can consider every single quadrilateral here, every single little diamond, as a representative of maybe a domain, a topic, maybe a communication task, whether it be writing, reading, speaking, or listening to another language. And in this case, this forms a bigger diamond of our competencies and how those languages work. If I were to label LA, LB, and LC, LA being English, LB being French, LC being Lao, then in this case, I could form myself in the bottom of that sort of bigger diamond and saying that I activate that sort of quadrilateral when I have to be at school, when I learn languages. And maybe right above it, LA, just by itself, that's how I express, for example, my emotions. Or for example, how I don't know, how I write. Maybe I write more in French than I write more in English than I write in French, which is such a shame, by the way. But it is true that we don't have balanced sort of competencies in general. And that's something that needs to be acknowledged. For people who are a little more interested in knowing how this study has worked, this complementarity principle, I'd recommend going to the Gassler study, which kind of goes into depth on how that worked out in percentages and polls on bilinguals and how they use their languages in certain domains. My computer, here we go. And then next little chart I'd like to use real quick is called the language mode continuum, which is also by François Grosjean. And this language mode model explains how bilinguals can activate and disactivate languages. It's kind of really interesting. And it's according to the situation, right? So if I have a situation with a professor, I'm not going to speak, for example, I'll speak French, but when I have a situation, I don't know, I have to talk to my brother, I'll speak English. In this case, what we have on the spectrum is, so we have the continuum on 1, 2, 3, 1 being near the monolingual mode, 3 being near the bilingual mode. Then we have language A and language B. Language A, for example, would be English for me, and language B would be French for me as well. I could give an example. Today, I'm in near 1 on the continuum. I am a monolingual, speaking to you only in English. And in this case, I activate my English, highly my English, and French is still there, but it's just kind of hanging there. And then I go to mode 2, for example, in the continuum, when I have to teach, for example, English to French speakers. I access my French and my knowledge of French grammar in order to teach English better to these students, which is really important for me to access French in order to understand why they make the mistakes they make. And how can I help them understand their grammar mistakes a little better, coming from their language, which actually really does enrich the learning experience and also the teaching experience. And then finally, the third part of the continuum or the spectrum, number 3, is bilingual language mode, where I have to activate, for example, my English and my French in school. We read and write in English and French. We watch videos in English and French. A lot of my professors like code switching. They switch between English and French all the time. So there's a moment where we decide when we activate and disactivate. We constantly we constantly evaluate our situation. We constantly say, is this the right moment to activate our English or not? Is this the right moment to activate French? Is this the right moment to activate Lao? And so it's a very interesting sort of phenomenon. And I thought I'd like to share this diagram. Hopefully it's not too complicated, or if I've lost anybody, don't hesitate to ask any questions at the end of the presentation. Moving on. So what does this all mean after all of this mumbo jumbo and this technical stuff, right? And what are the advantages and disadvantages, Victoria, of being bilingual? Let's go to the advantages. Bilinguals can adapt to a lot of social situations because the languages they possess help them to do so. There are languages, for example, that demand sort of social construction. They demand a social hierarchy. In Japanese, they have what we call terms of address, where according to how you address someone, that is their status in society, their hierarchy. Are they your boss? Are they your uncle on your mother's side or on your father's side? Are they someone you need to address this way or that way? In Lao, it's the same thing. For example, when I call my uncle, for example, my uncle from my mom's side, that's not the same word I will use in Lao than, for example, the uncle on my mother's side. I mean, father and mother. So it's really interesting because we're there's a lot more sensitivity to social situations. Then afterwards, being bilingual and multilingual delays the onset of Alzheimer's and dementia. I think that's a really kind of a fact that's been kind of widespread over the years, and a lot of articles, and it's been very popular, which is true. So who wouldn't want to speak another language in that case? And then another advantage would be by being bilingual, or bilingualism increases creativity and sort of linguistic and cerebral flexibility, actually. Some people say that when you learn a language, you become more creative. In this case, I haven't become artistically more creative, but I've been creative in other ways. But creativity is a part of it, because you have to kind of be creative in the sense of thinking about the world and thinking about how things are. For example, it took me a really hard time to understand that a table in French is feminine. I didn't really get that. In English, we don't have that. We don't have feminine and masculine. It took me a very long time to understand that I had to say une table. It took me a very, very long time to change my brain, to tell myself that that is feminine and that is masculine. And it's a really interesting study afterwards that's more on sex studies and yeah, that's a very interesting concept as well, because the French Academy is starting to actually change that, because now there are questions of assigning feminine and masculine to words. That's another debate. And then finally, the structure of languages they possess and their lexicon help bilinguals see, hear, and understand more of the world around them. And what I mean, go back to the example of the Greeks. In this case, they didn't have a word for blue, and so they saw blue differently, and blue didn't exist in their lexicon. Another example would be, for example, the Inuits. They have 11 terms to describe snow. Who has 11 terms to describe snow? It's incredible. I mean, how can we describe snow? So those are kind of these advantages that are actually go with bilingualism. Disadvantages happen to be more centered around the social constructs that we have around bilingualism. Communication in your weaker language can be difficult when the social construction of the perfect bilingual is present in the society. For example, if I felt, for example, that my Lao wasn't good enough and I was made fun of, and because I was supposedly supposed to be bilingual, and this is actually a true story, I was made fun of so much in Lao that I stopped speaking Lao because I wasn't the perfect bilingual to them. And in this case, what happened? I stopped speaking. And that's what a lot of times that happens to a lot of people. They're told that you're not bilingual. You weren't able to translate that word. You didn't know that. You're not able to translate. It's a myth to say that bilinguals need to translate the words correctly or their concepts correctly. Sometimes bilinguals learn their concepts differently in different languages, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the same concepts. And that is a myth that needs to be debunked. It doesn't exist. It's a man-made story, really. It's a myth. And we need to go past that to accept that diversity in bilingualism. The second disadvantage that I would say is that not all concepts are learned in one language and are constructed equally. What I mean by that is, for example, when I was doing this presentation, I had to take my notes in French and just transcribe them in English. And I thought, yeah, it'll be fine. It took me such a long time because I realized that I learned all of this in French for the past, I don't know how many years. And I said, God, I'm not an English speaker because I don't know how to translate it anymore. But it's not that. It's just the concepts are different. And I learned it in French and I had to retranscribe it in English. So sometimes it can be complicated to juggle those concepts because they're not equally acquired. So that is a disadvantage in some ways, but it does lead to some richness in the way that we use languages. And then finally, code switching and code mixing can be perceived as weak knowledge of the two languages, considering the case, again, of imposing this image of a perfect bilingual. When other people are outside of it and they're seeing these bilinguals switching languages, they must think, God, they're lazy. They don't know how to say that completely in just one language. It's not that. It's just, it's about the diversity and the richness of the concepts we choose. I'll choose one word in English better than in French because I feel like in English it expresses it better than in French. And I know that everybody around me will understand both. So I'll say, cool, man. And then I'll say something in French, and my colleagues will understand that. I think that's what it is. And I think it shouldn't be perceived as being weak. It's the collective imagination that misconceives these phenomenons as being weak, being a weak bilingual or not being a bilingual, whereas they are actually a vital part of being bilingual. Code switching and code mixing is a vital part of being bilingual. So now I'd like to kind of go through a little bit of my classmates' perspectives. And I found this to be interesting. I actually wrote a big email to everybody, wonderful people. 14 young women, we're a class of only women, this year, so girl power. And we're all really just really talented people. I've never met such talented multilingual people in my life, and I'm so inspired by my class. And I'm really, really honored and very, very lucky that they contributed to this PowerPoint. I've had even last night people sending me articles, read this just in case for your talk, good luck tomorrow. It's really, really wonderful. So I thought I'd share some of their perspectives today on what it's like to speak multiple languages amongst this scientific stuff that we've seen before. So this is Lori. And she actually studied Japanese at INALCO. I put the full text here for people who would like to read it later on. And I believe that this PowerPoint will be on the registered video. But just to kind of summarize what she has to say, we call this in social linguistics a language portrait, where we represent our languages with ourselves and how those languages and where those languages are placed. And so just to kind of summarize, you have kind of the three different flags above, French, British, and Japanese, and they're located actually in her head. And she says they are the languages she's working with and studying with. Then we go down to the ears, which is interesting. She goes down to the ears and she says, I can read hello in Persian, Italian, Spanish, Korean. And she has she's notions in all of these languages, but hasn't practiced them in a while. So when she says notions, it means she has a couple of notions. It doesn't mean she possibly speaks them specifically. And I would like to just say for the monolinguals out there who think that they're monolingual, it's not true. You've been exposed to languages. And then going to her mouth where she speaks. Japanese is the language she speaks, she communicates in, and she speaks Japanese to people every day, thanks to INALCO. And so she communicates in Japanese. And then in her heart, which is interesting, in her heart, she feels French and English. Her father is Scottish, so she speaks English with him. He responds in French. The grandparents speak English, but they speak French as well. So she speaks English. Sometimes they respond in French and vice versa. It's very natural in their family. And I think this portrait is really, really great because it shows how languages are placed and how we feel and how we valorize languages in ourselves. And then the last example I'd like to give is of Aishwarya. She was actually in the interview with me to get into this program. And she's really, she actually comes from India, Maharashtra, near Bombay or now Mumbai. And she represented her languages through chakras, interesting enough. And for people who don't know, each chakra has a different meaning in general. There's sort of these energy channels in certain Eastern medicinal practices. And so this is what she says. Starting from the bottom, the red, the root chakra, she signifies a sense of belonging. In this case, it's her mother tongue, Marathi, from Maharashtra. The orange circle signifies pleasure. And this is represented with French because she actually wanted to learn French with pleasure. And then moving up, the yellow circle is power and ability to channel. In this case, it's Hindi because it's one of the official languages of India. And then we have the heart chakra, the green one, that signifies love and relationships. And that language is Telugu, which is her boyfriend's mother tongue or native language. She's learning Telugu at INALCO, and she's learning it for love. Going up, the throat chakra, blue. This signifies self-expression. And in this case, she feels as if she can express herself better in English. And then finally, the third eye chakra, purple, is a sense of purpose and direction in life, which is again for her French. And then finally at the crown, she told me that Sanskrit is also a part of it as well, because Sanskrit is a language that she doesn't necessarily understand, but she hears and speaks. It's a very religious language in India. And I find that to be really interesting how she was dividing her languages in that way. And this, of course, PowerPoint will be available for people who would like to read it later on. So to conclude, so what can we say about bilinguals and multilinguals? Throughout this presentation, we've seen types of bilingualism, the acquisition of bilingualism. But we've also seen some of my classmates' perspectives, their point of view of how they live languages. You know, being bilingual or multilingual is a visceral experience. We feel, we see, we hear and touch our multiple languages. We can see that the map of the United States in linguistic diversity that we've seen earlier does not represent the diversity that we have linguistically. Language can't be constrained in one geographic region. We live the language, we are these languages, and it's a part of an individual's identity. I believe that we need to embrace this linguistic diversity in the USA in order to move forward in accepting all identities and the languages that make up those identities. We are a nation found by immigrants and made up of immigrants. Immigrants who bring their languages with them, because language is identity. And that's what I would like to say today about all of this. Thank you. I'm just going to leaving this quote here real quick for people who want to read.
Absolutely amazing. So I know there have been some comments and questions and things going through in the chat. We open up this opportunity. Victoria, I don't know if you want to take a peek at the chat.
Yeah, sure. My mouse was kind of bugging a little bit there. I'm going to keep that up. Sorry, I don't know. I have an old computer, 2013 Mac. Let me just get in there. Oh, there we go. Okay, great. Awesome. What do we got here?
So
all
if
right.
Has any direct questions, you want to throw it into the chat, or feel free to just raise your hand, let us know, and we can.
Yeah, feel free to talk. I like talking. I'm ready to chat. Anybody? Razel, it's my old classmate who witnessed my Arabic days. Razel has a question. Hi, Razel. How are you?
Hi, can you hear me?
I can. We can all hear you. What's going on?
Oh, good. Hello, everybody. Not much. Oh my God, I'm so proud of you. Look at how far we both come. But anyway,
I know, right?
I do have
She's a neuroscientist at UPenn. Yeah.
Well, I'm in Indiana now, but okay.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll catch up. What would you recommend, like, the best way to learn a language as an adult? Like, what would be, as someone living in the US?
Yeah, I mean, you know, one of the main things that I kind of struggle with, and it's not a scientific thing, it's more of a personal experience thing. I think one of the main things is to kind of accept the fact that you're going to make mistakes and that you're going to feel like a child when you speak. I remember when I came to France and I ended up ordering what we call noisette, which is like a macchiato. I ordered that for 6 months because I couldn't pronounce anything else. And so I ordered it for 6 months. And at one point I was like, I just want to stop drinking this noisette. I need to learn more French. And I think with that sort of thing, you have to create a need and you have to create a desire. You know, the motivation for languages, it's about really transferring your brain, but liking something. For example, what made me really want to watch French TV was Koh-Lanta, which is French Survivor. There are other things like that. You have to attach yourself to culture and things you like and get outside of your comfort zone where, like, you know, if you make a mistake, it's not a big deal, you know? Like if I make a mistake in French, which I do every day, and it's quite embarrassing in front of my professors, especially when I'm nervous. But it's true, I make mistakes and I acknowledge it. And at the same time, if you don't open your mouth, you'll never know if you're going to do it. So my take is that just try, for example, if you find some kind of series in the language that you want to learn, just kind of listen to it. It's kind of like music. You kind of have to get used to it because sometimes there are phonemes or sounds that we're not used to in one language that exist in other languages, and kind of listening to what it sounds like, getting into some culture, maybe looking at the BuzzFeed in their language. That's funny. It's funny exercise to do. I look at BuzzFeed in French, which is really weird. So I'd recommend that, maybe changing certain things, like changing your Facebook into that language that you want to practice. And then just kind of not letting it go and expressing yourself and getting out there, and don't be scared to make mistakes. I hope that answers your question. We'll talk more about it later. I'll have more stories for you.
Yes. Oh, we have 10 years to catch up on.
Oh, 10 years.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That was great.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Did anybody have any other questions? Oh, there are questions about INALCO. Okay. Is there a way for students who are not bachelor's or master's students at INALCO to take courses from there that you know of? Madame Peignet, I don't know if we can. Attends, ça va vite là. Attends. Oh, too many questions. All right. So, okay, hold on. There's so many questions at the same time. It's too fast for me. You all are too fast. So the first question about bachelor's and master's, I believe that you can come to INALCO for the passport. That is possible. The passport degree does exist where people come just to learn languages to travel. And that is available for people who don't want to do heavy degrees. And I believe the question of, for people who do want to come and study at INALCO later on, who are interested in our institution, and if there are questions of not speaking French well enough, our department in second language learning, we're pretty good at teaching French. And I guess the proof would be me, because they actually helped me with my French. So there shouldn't be a fear on American sides to actually speak another language or come and dive in. Very welcoming community with multiple nationalities, multiple languages, and we'd be more than happy to have you if you'd like to come and learn. You don't have to necessarily do a degree, just stop on by, would be more than happy to welcome you. Any other questions? I feel like the chat, my mouse is still not working very well. I'm not sure.
There was a question a little earlier in the chat that I just pulled and put it in. I got
you got me. Thank God. Thank God.
Do you
Go ahead.
think that watching TV, listening to music or cartoons or movies is a good way to just kind of acclimate your ears to listening to a new language? Does it do something even beyond that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think some of my French has come out of it. I break out in French songs now, like karaoke box on occasion. Yeah, it does help a lot. You know, there's a certain reference and a certain emotional attachment that you could have with that as well. I think it's really important to personalize your learning experience and your learning journey. I think it's really important to personalize that and not just stick to a textbook. You know, in textbooks, things are very sort of categorical and very grammatical and very technical. You know, I think it's better to come outside of that and to explore that, you know, and even if you want to push yourself even further, no subtitles in this case, that's very scary to do. But yeah, I really would encourage that if you could. It's going to be a slower process, but it'll get your ear going, definitely. Mm-hmm.
So especially in relation to like the different kinds of acquiring bilingualism that you talked about in the presentation, would you say that it's better to do something that you're already familiar with? So like we grew up reading and watching Harry Potter. Should I listen to Harry Potter, watch Harry Potter, read Harry Potter in my new target language? Or should I do something completely new that I've never been exposed to before?
That's like a really good question. So I think everybody has their own choice. I started reading Harry Potter in French, which is very interesting because the names are different. So I would recommend, I mean, you can do that if you feel uncomfortable going into the unknown completely. And I think it also kind of cushions the culture shock of going straight into French literature. For example, if you want to learn French and moving into some literature that you kind of are familiar with, Harry Potter in French, which is kind of, we would say like, I would say, yeah, middle school, high school French. So yeah, I'd recommend, even if you know it in English and you kind of go into French, I mean, it could be interesting. At the same time, if you really want to push yourself, maybe discovering new ways of this language and maybe, new sort of, how would you say, TV series or movies, or like I found Koh Lanta, which is French Survivor, which I never thought existed. You know, attaching yourself to the culture itself would be ideal. But afterwards, you know, there are baby steps. It's not as if you have to go all or nothing, you know, like you go baby steps, you know, 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day. It's like you can't run a marathon if you don't train. So you got to train little by little. You know, you got 5 kilometers here, 5 kilometers there, et cetera, et cetera. And you're not going to do it in one day. And if you forget a word, it's not a big deal. But it's little by little. I would recommend not exhausting your brain too much, because I've done that in the past and it's been very detrimental to my French learning. So yeah, I recommend it definitely. Anything you're familiar with in another language, try it out, see what happens. See if you can recognize certain words, because a lot of words share a lot of roots together. Yeah. What other questions do you have? How do you recommend begin learning a language? Figure out why you're learning the language. I think that's another thing. Why are you learning the language? That's really interesting. I think it's important for people to ask themselves why they're learning their language, you know, and their motivation. Once you know why you're motivated and once you know why you want to learn a language, I think that comes easier. For example, I was learning French for my studies. I was learning Lao for my family, you know, and French has actually become a really integral part of my own identity and my own sort of way of being. And now I also recently learned French for more personal reasons because my partner is French and he doesn't speak English. And so it's actually also a personal reason that I learned French, to be able to express my emotions in French. So it really depends on the motivation and the types and how and why you want to learn a language. Ask yourself first, before you learn a language, why you want to learn a language, and then go through it, go through that process and ask yourself, okay, find things that interest you, culturally, etc. And now with technology and Zoom, you can have chats all the time on Skype and on Zoom and practice. So anything's possible. Yeah. Does anybody have any more questions? Karen raised your hand. Karen Adams, my God. All right. I'm listening, Karen.
I think she's muted.
Right. What advice do you have for secondary schools in the United States?
Oh man, that is
or to the school that you went to.
Oh, my dear, dear school. Karen is actually an old teacher of mine from high school. It's always been supporting me throughout the years, and I'm really happy and really honored that she's here today. I would recommend not only concentrating on how would you say, I'd recommend accepting the linguistic diversity within classroom. That's what I would recommend. I would recommend not just keeping into one language. I would recommend opening up the doors to having students exchange and share their languages, because we learn a language better through the languages that we know. So it's better to accept the languages that are present, so that way their concepts and the way that they learn the other languages are more easily assimilated. I think it's better to embrace linguistic diversity, like I had said before, in order to move forward and learning languages together, instead of keeping into the target language and saying we only need to speak Spanish because we're in a Spanish class. And I think it's better to kind of have that sort of comparison and accepting those languages. Oh, what do you say in your language? Oh, that's interesting. Let's write it on the board. That way everybody can make those connections together. And I think that's what I would recommend for second language learning in schools now. It's to not just keep in Spanish or keep in French, but to also welcome in the other languages that are present in the classroom in order to enrich that experience. I hope that answers your question, Karen.
Nice to see you.
It's nice to see you too. It's been a while.
Okay.
Yeah, and Celine and my director makes a really great point. The teacher doesn't necessarily have to speak all of the languages that are present in the class. We can't, but we can welcome them and allow also those classmates explain the links between those various languages, because it also valorizes the pupils' languages as well. Meaning, like, if everybody else doesn't speak the language, it's not a big deal. You can explain on the board, oh, that's interesting. People like my language too. It's valorized in the classroom. So I think that's a way of going through it. Yeah, you don't have to know all the languages, as Madame Penier says. You don't have to know all of them. It's just about understanding that they're present. That's basically it. And allowing the classmates or the pupils to have that conversation between themselves, which is really cool. I think Karen raised her hand again.
No, it's not down.
Okay.
All right. I think we've come to the end of our time together today. First of all, a huge thank you to you, Victoria. This has been an amazing presentation. I think all of us feel better about what we do know, as opposed to kind of feeling bad about what we don't know. So that's a huge thank you, I think, from all of us. And the idea that students can learn together and we can honor every language in the classroom as opposed to privileging one over another. Another great thing that I'm going to take away personally. I also want to thank all of you from coming all over the world to join us today. And if you're here next week, which for some of you, that'd be a long plane ride, you're going to want to join us in the Graham Center in room 150. We're going live and in person again next week. So thank you for being here. Thank you, Victoria. It's been awesome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yay.